you ever had a Phalaenopsis orchid that maybe struggles a bit? Maybe you don't know why it's not producing a flower spike. You've been doing everything right and you just don't know what's going on. You might have some rot in the actual roots. Let's dive into a video of how to deal with it, how to treat it, and hopefully give your orchid a better life and possibly blooms in its future. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see somewhere behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So yes, for today's video, I've got a couple of orchids, probably more than a couple at this point, that are struggling a bit. And I will caveat this to say very quickly that this is something that I occasionally have to deal with most of my orchids, which I have owned for over a decade now, and they are constantly blooming at least once every year or two, basically. And this is a natural process. Before we get into this any further, this is a natural process based on the medium that we are growing these plants in, a lot of the times tending to be something we call orchid bark. And that is because the orchid bark itself is a good media in the sense that it's not like sphagnum moss, it's not like cocoa coir chunks, although I have grown orchids happily in cocoa coir chunks, you just need to adjust it slightly, is that things will break down. If you think about if it's a rotting like log or piece of wood out in nature, at some point it will rot down to mush. So if these roots from these orchids, these Phalaenopsis orchids, are sitting on top of rotting wood essentially at that point, because you're constantly re-moistening this bark, eventually that rot will happen on the roots. Most Phalaenopsis orchids and a lot of other orchids that maybe not as kind of commonly found in things like supermarkets and big box stores can bounce back from this. So I want to scoot you down a bit and let's have a look at it together, and I can talk you through my process of how I deal with it in order to ensure that my orchids keep thriving and keep blooming all the time and they're just living their best life. Okay, I've scooted you further down just to kind of show you what I'm going to be doing, and I'll show you what these plants look like when they've got this issue. So, couple of plants that I've got here. Let's start with the one that has got the biggest problem. So, you can see this orchid, you can see kind of how old it is. Can you see that it's lifting off the soil? So that should tell you something. You can kind of see the roots here. They're still healthy roots, those aerial roots, and it's still even got some healthy roots that are popping out of the pot. Now, what I did with these specific orchids before doing any of this is I let them, even with the rot and everything else, I let them absorb some moisture. I put them in, kind of like drenched them, kept them in water in the pot themselves, in the cache pot, for a good hour or two. I want most of these healthier roots to have absorbed as much water as possible, and it will make sense in just a second when you see what's happening. So let's take it out of its rotting media. So let me show you again some of the slightly healthier roots that you might be able to see through that transparent pot, but you can also see an awful lot of rot. So if I was to just remove all of this now from this pot, and I'm going to squeeze it because I need to get rid of all of this. You are going to lose some roots. Do not worry about these. Their roots are quite fragile at the best of times, and they're quite chunky roots. So actually this is not looking too bad. But if I show you, so firstly you can kind of see that is not great in terms of what's in there. Same thing goes, like if you were to look at some of this media, it is kind of rotting out quite badly. So you can see actually I've got quite a few decent-ish roots. Did not realize this had a death collar on it. So what I want to do is I want to get rid of all of this growing media. We're not going to be reusing that. And let me talk you through my process here. So first thing you want to do, a pair of scissors, snips, anything you want to utilize, and then you need to sterilize this. So I like to use something like rubbing alcohol, and I will just spray it all down onto the tools to make sure that this is as sterilized as possible. I know some people do this with a flame as well. Do whatever works for you. And as anybody who has ever worked in science will ever tell you, is you want to let this dry. You want to let the alcohol just dry off. It won't take very long. Alcohol evaporates quite quickly. But you need to just be careful with this plant. I've also very specifically waited for this plant to finish blooming. It was blooming up until very recently. It's now at the stage where it's bringing in new leaves. And I've also got some old spent flower spikes. So my snippers are now dry. I'm just going to go in and take away some of those flower spikes. I've got a bin underneath me here. And essentially, I might fast forward this, but I'm just going to spend some time now clearing out all of the dried roots and the rotted roots. So, as I said, might just fast forward this really quickly, just so I'm not boring you to death. Okay, and I've removed most of the roots, and we've still got a decent level of rootage in here. The other thing I wanted to show you, which I was doing, is I removed that base. Because you can see, and you might be able to see if that will focus, it is bone dry. Also what I did, and I'll bring it up so you can kind of see, is things like this. Can you see that root there, where it was rotting up here, and there's healthy roots down here? Eventually that rot will move down. Also, you might see, let me see if I can find the saving segments so I can show you. So, this root here was looking relatively healthy, but you can kind of see where the rot is going to seep in. I preemptively cut that in order to make sure that this plant is going to survive and do its best life. Now, a lot of people might not have as many roots as I have on this one. And I do have another orchid that I'm going to do the same thing to, but it's got a slight different scenario there. And I wanted to show you that in its own kind of right, so you can kind of understand what you're getting into in that situation. But overall, this is a decent, much more decent root system than I would have expected. There's these things which are the aerial roots of the orchids, and they were above the soil. Now, if I didn't have any more of these roots that were used to being in the orchid bark, I might bury, say, 50% of these aerial healthier roots into the soil media to keep it anchored. But I need to keep some of these outside because they are adapted to be aerial roots, not roots that they are at the bottom. And you can see these are relatively healthy and plump because I watered it earlier on. Now, let's put this into some new growing media. So I've got a new pot, and if you can, get a taller pot, and these are the pots that have got the slits all the way around and they've got very large air holes. Do that. There are other ways of growing orchids, any type of orchid, more naturally, and I know Sarah, the plant rescuer, did a whole thing about this as maybe mounting orchids and letting them trail down instead of having flower spikes. That is an entirety of its own thing, basically, if you want to do this. But I'm growing them more traditionally, how you would see them in most shops being sold and how most people would probably have them in their house. So, fresh orchid bark. And you want to kind of fill up a bit of the base, not too much, because what you are then going to be able to do, and hopefully I'll be able to get most of these roots in this smaller pot. Will I be able to? Will I not? Possibly. Difficulty then is trying to get the actual orchid bark in, and actually I think I've maybe overfilled the orchid bark with this. So I'll take some of it out. So I mean, you just need a very tiny layer at the bottom just to make sure that the roots are sitting in something rather than just being in the holes. And then what I'll do is I'll try to get as many of these original roots that were in the growing media in with, and actually with this one I'm not going to have to add many or any of the aerial roots into the growing media. They will stay out in the air again. So this is where it gets a bit tricky, and you're going to need to finagle it in whatever way works for you. And I'm going to use my hands for this because it's the best way of me being able to get some of this orchid bark in here. Smaller orchid bark will work really well for this because you can get into the nooks and crannies, and just make sure that you are filling everything. Be sure wherever you're doing this that it's somewhere where you're okay to clean it up afterwards, because this is a messy, messy job. You saw me tap the side of the pot. It's just to make sure that that orchid bark gets in between all of those really, really chunky roots. It doesn't need to be touching everything. You're more giving it something to anchor itself in so it doesn't flop entirely. You might even want to use something like a janky support stick, at least until it kind of roots into the pot and into its new growing media. But essentially what you'll do now is what I'm doing here, and just keep filling it up until you reach the top of the pot and you've got enough media in there that it's relatively stable. It's more to stabilize the plant than anything else. Now, for the people that were wondering in the beginning where I said that I watered it before doing anything like this, this will all start to make sense now. Because what will happen, and that is now in its new pot and it's holding its own within that pot. I will show you what it looks like around. That is going to stay like that until its next watering. Because I don't want to put any more moisture than absolutely is needed, especially because I took so much rotting material out. So this is now done, and it is in its own new pot. Ta-da! That's one. All right, let's move on to the second orchid. And again, what I'm going to do is sterilize my cutting instrument before moving from one rotting orchid to another one. Again, letting it dry, and let me show you the second orchid. So this is what this orchid looks like, and we'll deal with some of that crisping on the leaves, but what I want you to see really quickly is that. That is the first time I think I've ever had, that is not a flower spike, that is something called a keiki or a keki, and it is a pup for this orchid. Now, you need to be treating this slightly differently, or also being aware of other things. So you can kind of see it's got some roots in there that are really tightly packed, and it's not doing great because there's also quite a bit of rot. I'm pretty sure most of the orchid bark has gone on this. Let's have a look and see when I take it out of its pot, if it will want to come out of its pot. Here, bit of squeeze. Bit of squeeze, I don't want to damage the good roots as much as possible. Yeah, so issues again with this one, and I will show you what that looks like. You can kind of see it there. It's not looking great. There's an awful lot of healthy roots, but there's also a lot of rotted roots. So the first thing I want to do is, just for cosmetic reasons, I want to get rid of some of this yellowing and dying off on some of the older leaves and deal with it there. That's what I mean. The signs were there. I knew that these plants needed this doing to them. Did I get around to doing it? No. The keiki might in itself be a way of this plant kind of going, oh no, I think I'm massively unhappy. I might be dying soon. Let's see about creating progeny, which is that keiki, in order to survive. Yeah? Pass on my genetic material so it can survive. So just cutting off the old flower spikes, which are dried at this point. There we go. Whilst everything flies all over the place. And essentially, it's going to be a rinse and repeat of what I did with the previous orchid. It's going in, snipping off all of the dried roots, so they don't have an opportunity to go towards rot. because a lot of the times it is the drier roots, because essentially if you think about it, it's a bit like kindling to fire. There's a lot of dry material there, there's rot that's happening, and it can kind of latch onto that drier material there in order to kind of survive. But again, I will shut up now and get to clearing this up so I can kind of show you what it's going to look like at the very, very end. I'm also taking off some of these roots that are a bit desiccated and they're a bit suspect, because again, I probably do have a decent level of roots in here that don't have rot in them yet. Another death plug, which again I hadn't realized was on this plant, but I don't know why I'm surprised, because this was one that I think was a gift and somebody probably got it from a supermarket or something like that, and they don't grow them in the best conditions. Now, the other thing to note, because I know I've got a lot of viewers in America, at least from what I've noticed here in the UK, and I would imagine it's the same in Europe if I'm remembering well from being back home in Greece, we generally don't tend to have these Phalaenopsis orchids being sold to us by and large in sphagnum moss. A lot of the time they are sold in orchid bark. So I know from what I've seen, at least online, that a lot of the ones in the States are being sold in sphagnum moss. And a lot of people are saying, you know what, first thing you need to do when you bring it home is take it out of the sphagnum moss. I would agree, because that will never dry fast enough for you not to have to deal with this issue super, super fast and super early. So bear that in mind when you are buying your orchids, and depending on where you are buying your orchids from as well. It would make sense. I'm not poo-pooing on the sellers or the growers that do that, because it just means that they need to water it a lot less frequently. And as you can imagine, something like an orchid probably needs watering quite frequently. And people might just not want to do that in their business, to have to water that plant all the time. So sphagnum moss does solve some of that problem. I'm having to really tease out these roots, because you could see when I brought it up, it was kind of like taking the shape of the pot. So bear that in mind. You might need to be a bit on the aggressive side, and you might end up losing more roots than you are intending. That is completely fine. If you've got a decent level of roots there, it shouldn't cause too much of a problem. Now you can see potentially that one, there's some rot that's happening at the tip of those roots. I just snipped off the tip, because I don't want that rot to have a chance to kind of fester any more than it's already had. And actually, this is a good little practice to have if you've got any other kind of tropical house plants, because a lot of people that might have not had to deal with root rot before might be a bit scared and worried. But actually, if you've got something like an orchid and you have to do this every so often, it really does show you the benefit of clearing out the rot. Okay, from all of that pot that had all of those roots, these are the only ones that are more or less viable at this point. I could be more aggressive with this, but I want to see how it will do. I got rid of the death plug, which was fine. The interesting thing with this is I'm not having to cut off a massive chunk at the bottom, because actually it's doing okay. But bizarrely enough, the actual stem at the bottom did not have that much rot in it. So I just need to give this a new pot and put in the growing media like I did before. The thing that I wanted to mention before about the keiki that we were seeing here, this whole process might mean that that keiki rejects, or it might drop. So that's the one thing I want you to remember with all this, is if you're doing all of this and you've got blooms and you want to keep the blooms, wait until the blooms are done. You might lose a couple of leaves, the rot might get a bit worse, but if you do this whilst got a bloom on there, barring the fact that you saw how aggressive I was being with all this, you're probably going to knock that bloom off. You're also, there's going to be such significant stress to the plant, because you've got rid of quite a few of its roots, you've jostled its roots. It's not natural. This wouldn't happen in nature for it to be this aggressively battered. It will then reject those blooms, especially if you've got bloom buds or if you've got a flower spike, the whole thing might just go. So bear that in mind. If you want to keep that, enjoy it, view it, and when it's done, then deal with what you want to deal with. And this is what I was doing with this plant. I wanted to enjoy its bloom for a bit longer because, and I'm going to say this with my entire chest, it might be a few months to even a year before I see blooms from either one of these plants until they get happy. Sometimes it's faster, but sometimes it can take its time. So let's give it its new pots. Let's see if it will fit, because I'm really hoping it will. These pots are better for them. Oh yes, and because it's got so much fewer roots now, it should be okay. That's actually all right. Right, let me get a couple of bits of bark at the bottom like I did with the previous one. Probably about right. And then same thing, put it into the actual pots. Make sure if you can that the roots are spreading as much as possible. You don't necessarily want them touching as much as it was on the previous one, although eventually at some point this will start circling like the other one did. And then just start filling up with the orchid bark. Again, remembering to tap the sides so that the orchid bark has a chance to kind of slip and slide in between those roots. And they're all kind of slowly going to make contact with the roots. Irony with this one, the way that the roots were growing and the way that it was in the previous pot meant that even before I put any orchid bark in this, it was pretty much, it's standing up on its own. It doesn't necessarily need the orchid bark for the support for this one. The other one did. This one is more for the moisture levels that it's going to need. And again, you can understand, based on quite how many roots I removed out of this one, why I have already watered this and it will be going in dry. And the reason for that is because I want any kind of cut sections that I've created on the plant to callus over, to basically, they're going to be exposed to air throughout all the little air pockets that are being created within that orchid bark, all of those chunks. And that's why a lot of the orchid pots have got the holes at the side of them in order to allow for that air to flow through. And let me give you an example here, basically. So you might look at this and just go, oh, there's a big air gap in there. Is that going to cause a problem? No, it's fine. Remember, these things are growing epiphytically. And if you grow any other house plants, you know what that means. They grow off the side of trees. They're growing in very little substrate or kind of materials, so they're fine. They'll be absolutely okay with this. This plant is looking a bit on the tall side. I'm okay with this. Again, might get a janky support stick at some point, but I have zero doubt that this is going to come back and do really well. It's quite nice with orchids because I've had them for so long and I've been doing this for so long that I know that I can be a bit more aggressive with them and they're absolutely fine. These things are beasts. They will be completely fine. You don't have to worry about babying it through this process. If you see me and anybody else, especially people that are orchid experts, I'm not an orchid expert, I'm still learning myself, but they will tell you the same thing. It's fine. They'll be okay, especially if it's just standard Phalaenopsis orchids or moth orchids that you might get in the supermarkets and the big box stores. They're okay. And just to kind of prove the point, that will then sit in its own little cachepot, and hey done presto. So that was my kind of quick guide on how to deal with if you've got rot on your orchid roots. It's not a death sentence by a long shot. They'll be fine. You saw how many roots have kind of survived. And as I said, if you've got all of the roots have rotted, but you've still got like 2, 3, 4 aerial roots off the top that are fine because they weren't in there, they weren't rotting in there, you can put most of them, if not all of them. You do need to keep some at the top if you can. If you've only got like 3 or 4 aerial roots, you're going to have to put them all in there. It's going to take a bit longer for it to come back. I had an orchid that was very similar to that. Every single one of its roots had rotted, and that was one of my oldest orchids. And it only had like 3 or 4 aerial roots. I put it in there. It did take a year. That is also one of my slowest orchids because it's got the slowest moth orchid or Phalaenopsis orchid because it's got the biggest blooms. That one only blooms once or twice a year for me. It took it a whole year to bloom, but it is a much, much, much happier plant now, and it's doing absolutely fine. So don't worry about it too much. But yeah, what did you think about this whole process? Do you do things differently? Is this something that you've tried before? Is this something that's new to you and you want to kind of be experimenting a bit with it? As I said, if you can, remember to sterilize your instruments. That's always a good idea if you're ever cutting any kind of rot or anything like that. You also want to make sure that it's drying after you've cut it, so you're not introducing more moisture. So what you don't want to do is what I just did and then water it. Ideally water it. I did it on the same morning. In an ideal world, do it the day before. So it's had enough time to absorb some of that moisture. And then after you've cut it, either you can just let it out. You don't have to put it straight into a pot like I just did now with bark. You can let it out for a day. That's absolutely fine. And then put the bark in and do what I did here. Or you could do it at the same time, just as long as you're putting in dry bark. You're not going to give it any moisture until the next time you water. For a lot of people, it might be once a week. And you should be golden. As I said, I use those tower pots. They've got the holes. They're clear as well. It means I can keep an eye out to see if there's any rot. A lot of the olden days, when I would lose, like when I was talking before, when I lost all of the roots to rot on that one specific orchid, is because it was in an opaque plastic pot and I couldn't see anything. And by the time I realized, I'm just like, oh, it's mush, it was too late. Whilst with these clear plastic pots, I've had things to do, so it's taken me a couple of weeks, if not a month, to get to them, but I knew that this was an issue. So it's a good idea to have those clear pots because you can see it and address it much earlier on. As you saw, I was able to save an awful lot of roots. I mean, look at everything that's gone, and that's not all of it. I've been putting stuff into the bin as well. But you'll be fine, and your orchid will thank you for it. So yes, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.